So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yirmiyahu the prophet, we find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As then we study further the importance of the merchants of the earth, we always make a reference of Yirmiyahu the prophet from the 20th through the 30th chapter. You'll find in the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and many other references related with this topic, plus other topics mixed with it. But then, most importantly, we find then Revelation chapter 1:8. Then Yohanan, he was then a revealed person, revealed Shaliach, revealed apostle in our regular and popular language. However, it's very important reminding ourselves that reading the Holy Instructions, the best language is the Hebrew. It's the most stable language ever. And many people, when they read Hebrew, they think the understandings, they have many meanings, but they don't. Hebrew is a very specific language and extremely stable. So then, as we read then Revelation chapter 1:8, we find then the mentionings of merchants. Let's then understand, firstly then, what the Messiah was speaking of kings of the earth, versus then a very important verse, where then the Messiah himself was explaining of the great ones of the earth. Let's try then read a section of these. Then we are studying chapter 1:8, and then let's read a section of the 23rd and 24th verses. You find then, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth. It's a very important section of it. Often, when angels would show up, they would give, at times, brief explanations. Those explanations, they had only a single meaning. You can only have these understandings matching with the understandings of the prophets. You can't have these understandings moving around as you would in any other language. Hebrew is a kind of a project where if you have then mechanics, each section of it must be properly and precisely placed in the project. You can't move around. So then sometimes when you are reading Hebrew, try to understand Revelation was recorded in Hebrew. There is no such a thing reading Revelation from any other source, any other language. It simply doesn't exist. It's understandable that those Greco people at some point, they had a hold of some of the Megillas that were obviously placed away, secured, and they found those documents. But much later, the time of Revelation and the Revelator was much earlier. So then, as we read a section of Revelation, we must find these specific understanding in the prophets. You can't go around only speaking of revelation without the prophets. If you do, you're going to set up yourself for failure. At some point, you're going to stumble in your own words. Because the only security of the instructions is layering properly. That's why the Messiah said not a layer is going to be left uncompleted. Every layer of understanding must be completed. He was explaining the situation regarding many prophets. When he was involved with the completion of the spring feast, he was not doing his own thing. He was precisely reading what the prophets had made mention of him. So in turn, he was then explaining of himself and then explaining the prophecies. So the prophecies explain of him and himself explaining of the prophecies. It sounds redundant, but it's not. Let's try to understand then this section. As we are then reading Galah, or Revelation chapter 1:8. What does it mean, revelation? Revelation means simply a person revealed. As far as chapter 1:8, the number doesn't exist. If you read the content of this chapter, it is the prelude of the holy cities of the time of the restoration period. Try to read it for yourself. The Messiah is explaining, come out of her, my people, and resume your duties. This is what he was explaining, in other words. But when you read in Hebrew, he explains very simply. Because the Messiah always explained the situation regarding then the destruction at the end. He was always focusing the future of the earth, and truly is destruction. Not because he wanted their plans to become unusable. It's because where they were placing so much focus of their own workings, and the Messiah was explaining, what you are doing simply is going to be destroyed. Don't place your focus on situations that are simply going to be destroyed. He was not implying that a person should be lazy. That's not the point. So then, let's read it again. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth. The Messiah is explaining then, when the new system comes, he will remind his people and they should resume their services. However, he's not going to take him by the hand. The situation is going to be so intense in the very near future that they're going to oblige themselves of reuniting them as per the instructions of Moses. They won't have any choice. So then, where do we read then the merchants of the earth? Chapter 1:8, verse 11. Then you find, and the merchants of the earth. He speaks also of kings. But try to understand the tone of his voice. He places then the kings as secondary. But the merchants of the earth, he mentions the great ones. So it's truly showing you that the power of decision making is in the hands of the merchants, precisely in the hands of logistics, transportation, and those people dealing with packages. We find these later very true. So then, let's speak of volume. What do we understand of volume? V-O-L-U-M-E, volume. Nations are preparing themselves, yet they think they can place under the control. Mostly of the problems you are facing today is people nosing around someone else's website or bank information and so on and so forth. But then the situation when the Messiah then speaks and he is involved, it's becoming simple but laborious. You can't be lazy. A lazy person has no place before the Messiah. You can write it down. It does not mean when a person has some sort of a problem that the Messiah rejects. That's not the point. The point is a person conscientiously being lazy has no place before his presence. Simple and direct. So when you read then the prelude of this time, you read then the merchants of the earth, and the merchants of the earth, and the merchants of the earth, and then the merchants of the earth were the great ones. He's explaining what is coming in the very near future. However, we find the computer, yet this vehicle, where then, though the computer can read many packages, it's going to require a vast, in quote, army of clerks to get then the movement of packages going on around the world. Truly, some of these companies are very top-notch, such as FedEx, DHL, UPS. These are obviously very modernized, so they can handle these kinds of situations. However, if you combine them, they won't be able to handle a lot of what's coming. It is much, much, much more than what they are handling these days. When the Messiah is explaining of this time, he's not dealing with tiny numbers. He is dealing with a worldwide time where during his time he was able then to provide what the people wanted as far as the prosperity that they wanted so much. Try to understand it, don't misquote it. He was not providing them with what was then given as then license to sin. That's not the point. The point is, because of his word, as he was speaking during his year after his coming from the dead, prior of his ascension, as he was explaining then those feasts step by step, the very normal factor of these was prosperity coming in a natural way. Then let's read verse then 1:7. For in 1 hour such a great wealth was desolated in every ship pilot, in every company of the ships. It's very plain. If those were my words, then could read in a certain way or the other. But when it comes from the Messiah himself, he's explaining and warning. He speaks of logistics, precisely of what's coming. And the problem is not logistic itself, not even financial. The problem is volume. The volume of materials and packages nearly can't be counted, of so much of it. What then is the position of the governments? They won't have any position. liking it or not. And I know for sure politicians and people of the desk jobs, they don't like to hear it, but they don't have a choice. As people were angry with the Messiah during his time prior of his ascension, because of he was explaining the time of the end, then they acted as the king of Babylon of the 3rd chapter of Daniel. They want to make a kingdom of their own. Obviously they were angry. They wanted a Messiah to give what they wanted, and they want a person then to receive them as they are. With sin or not sin, one way or the other, with the tabernacle or not, they want to be as what they are. The Messiah, no. There were instructions given to Moses, and the city must be secluded, must be holy per instructions. Either we understand these or we don't understand this. If we do understand, we are saved. If we don't understand, we are not saved. So then you understand. Messiah himself was explaining, only a few must find a way. Only a few. Because of this very factor. People, they reject the knowledge of the instructions, but they want a Savior to save them at the end. There is no way. You must understand tabernacle. And it's not complicated. As far as the Gentile perspective, it's simply a report at the gates of the holy cities. That's it. From there, we receive understandings as far as the people of those cities being from the lineage. They obviously function with the 7 spirits of Elohim, 7 functions, as you find then in, some say, New Testament. Not sure what kind of New Testament they are speaking of. Simply was the coming of the Holy Spirit, and then they were functioning. And then each person must then read what then Shaliach Shaul has said, as far as Romans chapter 8. Okay, it's not complicated. Then when we read Revelation in the Greco language, we must always make a reference with the prophets. The Messiah quoted Yeshayahu very often. Yeshayahu is the very basis of these understandings. The Messiah is the completion. Yeshayahu is the basis. You find every aspect of the instructions or the Torah or then Revelation. You find the prophets, you find the writings, then Psalms. Every area at some point, not in every chapter, but the 66 chapters, you find always a section of every instructions ever. Then, because of these, we understand then the new system. The basis then is volume. The situation is changing very rapidly. And as far as we can understand of the virtual financial system, it's already indicating of what's coming in the future. Is it easy to do it? Depends on what angle you observe. There are advantages regarding the new system. Firstly, then, each transaction is maintained by the computer. It's much easier to find and get scoundrels in jail. There is so much wealth in the world these days. So much of it. The politicians, they have more trouble trying to hide wealth than being scoundrels themselves. Try to understand the analogy. It's not a fact of lack of money. It's the fact of hiding what they have. And they are exhausting their list of understandings how to hide wealth. And the computer is placing them in the open. Let's read it again. Then this understanding from Revelation chapter 1:8 verse 1:7. And every ship pilot, speaking of captains of ships, and the companies of the ships. When we read chapters previously, we find chapter 8, for instance, then the burning. Chapter 8, if you understand, is the releasing of the atomic weapons. It is the final end in the starting of the autumn feast. So I'm saying, when is going to start the autumn feast? Try to understand, the Messiah is showing himself up in the autumn. He's coming in autumn. Okay? But the period of time of the pit and the spiritual release of those events is when the bomb touches the ground. That's when you find in the pit. Chapter 8 is the opening of the pit. And then he mentions of this period. Then he speaks of angels. He speaks of shofars. There are no trumpets. Those were invented. And there was a mountain of burning mountain. You can observe very intently what makes a burning mountain, other than when the bomb hits then the ground with petroleum, what takes place with the petroleum then when it comes out of the earth. And so on and so forth. And then mentions of the burning of the ships. Then the third part of the ships. Truly, the reality of it, the ships, they're going to be nearly everywhere. But the understanding is the amount of ships burned in a third part of the earth. Then the number of ships, it doesn't state. But the third part of the earth then contaminated with petroleum, and the ships destroyed. So then the great ones obviously are the ship's company. And the kings, they are quote-unquote servants of those merchants. That's where they get their wealth from. If the system runs nicely, the kings, they run nicely. If the merchants, they do not run nicely, the kings won't run nicely. They are directly related. In this situation of nations gorging themselves with the printing money, these will stop. Because the wealth must be justified as nations, they gather taxes. What can we say as far as then the companies? As you can understand, FedEx, DHL, UPS are the great ones of the earth, besides others. What's going to make them extremely important is where then the time and place where they link the taxes of the government with packages. That's when then the authority of the kings then takes place, and then there is a transfer of power from kings, and then the merchants, they take over. Because the direct relation with kings and merchants is then when the kings are receiving taxes. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.